the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory, a land carved by grit and God, a woman's virtue was her only currency. For Louisa Parsons, daughter of the formidable Reverend Michael Parsons, it was a cage, trapped in the dusty town of Redemption, a place that promised salvation but delivered only judgment. Her life was a tapestry of silent prayers and unspoken desires. She was the town's porcelain doll, admired from a distance, but never truly touched. That all changed on a blistering Tuesday in July, the day her world collided with a man the town saw as less than human, a man whose silence spoke more than any sermon she'd ever heard. This isn't just a story of forbidden love. It's the story of a woman's soul set ablaze, and the impossible choice she made when a quiet Apache warrior changed her life with 5 simple words. Let's start slow. The town of Redemption, Arizona, was built on 2 things: silver and scripture. The silver had long since dwindled to a trickle of dust in the pockets of hopeful prospectors, but the scripture that remained in abundance. It flowed from the pulpit of the First Union Church every Sunday, a torrent of fire and damnation from the mouth of Reverend Michael Parsons. And his daughter Louisa was its living testament. At 19, Louisa Parsons was a creature of quiet observation. Her world was confined to the whitewashed walls of the parsonage, the polished pews of the church, and the narrow aisles of Gables Mercantile. She had her father's piercing blue eyes, but her late mother's gentle mouth, a combination that made the men of Redemption stare with a mixture of piety and possession. They saw in her a purity they wished to claim, a silence they mistook for simplicity. They did not see the fire banked deep within her, the questions that churned like a river beneath a frozen surface. Life in Redemption was a ritual. Mornings were for chores and Bible study, afternoons for mending her father's stark black coats or tending the small, struggling garden behind the parsonage. Evenings were for silent dinners, where the clinking of a fork against a plate felt like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. Her father was a man who believed idle hands and idle thoughts were the devil's playground. Louisa's hands were never idle, but her thoughts ran wild across the sun-scorched mesas that surrounded the town. She dreamed of the world beyond the jagged peaks, a world she only knew from the tattered books she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room. The only disruption to her meticulously controlled life was Sheriff Brody Thompson. He was a bull of a man with a thick neck that strained against his collar and a possessive gaze that made Louisa's skin crawl. He was the law in Redemption, a position he wielded with the subtlety of a branding iron. He considered Louisa his future, a fact he'd made clear to her father, who saw the match as a righteous alliance of law and faith. A fine day, Miss Parsons' Sheriff Thompson would boom cornering her outside the Mercantile, his shadow swallowing her whole. He'd remove his hat, revealing a pate of thinning, sweat-slicked hair. A fine day for a walk. Perhaps you'd allow me to escort you home. Thank you, Sheriff, but I am quite capable, she would reply, her voice barely a whisper, clutching her basket of flour and beans like a shield. He would laugh, a grating sound like rocks grinding together. Of course you are. A strong, virtuous woman. Just what this town needs. What I need. His intentions were as plain as the dust on the street, and they terrified her. Marrying Sheriff Thompson would not be an escape. It would be the trading of one cage for another, smaller and more suffocating. Her father saw it as her duty. Louisa saw it as a death sentence for a life she hadn't even begun to live. One sweltering afternoon, as she was replacing the hymn books in the church pews, the sheriff entered his boots, echoing ominously in the sacred space. Louisa, he said, his voice softer than usual, which was somehow more menacing. Your father and I have been talking. He agrees it's high time you were settled. I've got a good piece of land staked out north of town. A good spot for a house. For a family. Louisa froze her back to him. The smell of old paper and lemon oil filled her senses. Sheriff, I am not ready for such things. He stepped closer, his presence a heavy weight behind her. A woman is always ready for God's plan. And this is it. You may. It's a good, solid future. He reached out his thick fingers, brushing her arm. The touch was like a spark of lightning on dry tinder. She flinched away, dropping a hymn book. It landed with a loud, definitive thud. "Do not touch me," she said, the words surprising her with their force. Thompson's face hardened. The pretense of courtship vanished, replaced by a raw, brutish anger. "You're the Reverend's daughter. You'll do as you're told. You'll learn to be a wife." "My wife?" He turned and strode out, leaving her trembling in the silence. In that moment, something inside Louisa fractured. The quiet, obedient daughter felt a surge of rebellion so fierce it stole her breath. She looked out the tall, arched window at the endless expanse of red rock and unforgiving sky. She didn't want a future staked out for her by men like her father and Brodie Thompson. She wanted the horizon. She wanted to breathe. She just didn't know how. The catalyst came 3 days later in the form of a runaway horse. Her father had sent her to the far side of the creek to deliver a balm to the ailing Mrs. Webster. The mare, a skittish creature named Patience, was her only companion. On the way back, a rattlesnake startled from its sunbath, coiled and struck out its rattle, a sound of pure panic. It missed the horse's leg, but the sudden violent motion was enough. Patience reared, screaming, her eyes wide with terror. Louisa, an inexperienced rider at best, was thrown. She landed hard on the baked earth, the air forced from her lungs in a painful gasp. The world spun in a dizzying haze of blue sky and red dust. Patience's reins flying, bolted, disappearing over a rise in a cloud of her own making. Louisa lay there for a long moment, dazed and aching. Her ankle throbbed with a sharp, insistent pain. When she tried to stand, a cry escaped her lips as white-hot agony shot up her leg. She was miles from town with a sprained, possibly broken ankle under the merciless glare of the afternoon sun. Panic began to set in cold and sharp despite the heat. No one knew exactly where she was. Hours could pass, night could fall. Here the desert was not a romantic landscape. It was a patient killer. She began to drag herself toward the meager shade of a lone mesquite tree, the rough ground scraping her hands raw. Tears of frustration and fear stung her eyes. It was then that she saw him. He wasn't there one moment, and the next he was. He stood on the ridge, silhouetted against the sky, as still as the ancient rocks around him. He wasn't a cowboy or a prospector. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple collarless shirt. A single feather was tied in his long black hair. He was Apache. Everything her father had ever preached about the godless savages flooded her mind. Tales of raids, of brutality, of a people without souls. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. He began to move down the slope towards her, his steps silent and sure-footed. He moved not like a man walking over the land, but like a part of the land itself. As he drew closer, she could see his face. It was lean and high-cheekboned, his skin the color of rich copper. His eyes were dark and intelligent, holding a deep, profound stillness that she had never seen in another person. There was no menace in them, only a calm, assessing curiosity. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze taking in her predicament, the awkward angle of her leg, the dust caking her dress, the fear in her eyes. He said nothing. The silence stretched thick and heavy. In town, silence was an absence of noise. Out here with him, it felt like a language all its own. Finally, Louisa found her voice, though it came out as a ragged whisper. "Please don't hurt me." A flicker of something amusement, sadness passed through his eyes. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He knelt, his movements fluid and economical, and gestured toward her injured ankle. "May I?" he asked. His voice was low and resonant, his English perfect-shaped, with a precision that was almost startling. Wary but seeing little choice, she nodded. His hands were gentle as he examined her ankle, his touch surprisingly cool against her feverish skin. He probed the swelling with a practiced skill that spoke of a deep familiarity with injury. "It is not broken," he said, looking up at her, "but badly twisted. You cannot walk on it." He stood and surveyed the landscape, then walked a short distance and returned with the branch of a creosote bush. He broke off a piece and held it out to her. "Chew this. It will help with the pain." She hesitated. Her father's warnings screamed in her head, but the agony in her ankle was a more immediate sermon. She took the branch, the bitter medicinal taste flooding her mouth as she bit into it. He then disappeared over the ridge, leaving her alone once more. For a moment, she thought he had abandoned her. But minutes later he returned, leading her mare, Patience, who was now perfectly calm, nuzzling his hand as if he were an old friend. He had fashioned a makeshift splint from sturdy branches, and strips of leather he produced from a pouch at his side. He bound her ankle with a firm, steady pressure. "I am Takoda," he said as he worked. It was the first time he had offered his name. "Louisa?" She replied, the name feeling foreign on her own tongue. When he was finished, he stood and offered her his hands. "We must get you out of the sun." She took his hands. His grip was strong and calloused, yet respectful. He lifted her, as if she weighed nothing, his strength a stark contrast to his lean frame, and set her carefully onto her horse's back. He then began to lead the mare not back toward redemption, but towards a small, hidden canyon she had never known existed. They walked in silence for what felt like an eternity. The bitter herb was beginning to work, dulling the sharp edge of her pain. She watched the man ahead of her, the easy rhythm of his stride, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. He was more at home here than anyone she had ever known. He was not a trespasser in this land. He belonged to it. He led her to a shaded overhang by a small, clear spring. He helped her dismount and settled her with her back against the cool rock. He gave her water from a skin, and it was the sweetest, most life-giving thing she had ever tasted. They sat there for a long time as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The beauty of it was so intense it hurt her chest. She had seen countless sunsets from her window in Redemption, but she had never felt one like this. "You are not afraid anymore," Takoda observed, his voice soft. It wasn't a question. "No," she admitted, surprised to find it was true. I have been afraid my whole life. Afraid of my father, of Sheriff Thompson, of God's judgment. Afraid of everything." She looked at him, the man her world had taught her to fear above all else. "But not of you." A small, sad smile touched his lips. "It is good to not be a monster in someone's eyes." He looked out at the fading light. "Your people see only what they have been told to see." "And your people," she asked gently, "what do they see when they look at me?" "They see the daughter of a man who speaks of a loving God, but whose heart is full of hate for those who are different." He answered with no malice, only a simple statement of fact. The honesty of it struck her. There were no pleasantries here, no social niceties, just truth as stark and unyielding as the landscape around them. She felt a lifetime of pretense fall away. "I have never," she started, then stopped a blush creeping up her neck. She looked at her hands, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. I have never been held by a man. Or even kissed. The confession tumbled out of her raw and mortifying. She expected him to laugh or to look at her with pity. Takoda simply watched her, his dark eyes unreadable. The silence settled around them again, but this time it was filled with a palpable tension, a strange new electricity. He reached out not to touch her, but to gently remove his hat, a simple dusty felt thing. He held it in his hands, turning it over slowly. His gaze met hers, and the stillness in his eyes was now mingled with a deep, aching tenderness. "Let's start slow," he replied, his voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate through the very rock she leaned against. Takoda did not take her back to redemption that evening. He insisted her ankle needed a night of rest and elevation. He built a small smokeless fire in a hollow of rocks, the flames dancing like captured spirits. He shared his food with her, strips of dried meat and roasted piñon nuts, and showed her how to make a tea from desert herbs that soothed her nerves and eased the last of her pain. That night, under a blanket of stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch Louisa, spoke more than she had in her entire life. She told him of her mother who had died when she was a child, a woman she remembered only as a scent of lavender and a sad, fleeting smile. She spoke of her hidden books, of her dreams of seeing an ocean, a thing so vast she couldn't truly imagine it. Takoda listened. He truly listened, not with the impatient ear of her father, or the leering attention of Sheriff Thompson, but with a deep, absorbing focus that made her feel seen for the very first time. In turn, he spoke of his world. He didn't speak of battles or raids, but of the rhythm of the seasons, of the stories his grandfather told him, of the before times when his people were as free as the eagles. He spoke of the spirits that lived in the rocks and the wind, and of the sorrow of seeing his world shrink, hemmed in by fences and forts, and the iron will of men like her father. He had been sent to a mission school as a boy, a failed attempt by the government to kill the Indian, save the man. It was there he had perfected his English, but it was also there he had learned the profound hypocrisy of the white man's world. He carried two worlds within him and was at home in neither. "They taught me your Bible," he told her, his voice devoid of bitterness. "I read of a man who loved his enemies and welcomed the outcast. I have not met many of his followers in your town." As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in soft hues of rose and grey, he helped her back onto Patience. The ride back was silent, but it was a different kind of quiet now, one filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. He led her to the edge of town, just within sight of the church spire. "I cannot go further," he said, "to be seen with you. It would be dangerous. For you. Will I see you again?" The question was breathless, desperate. The thought of returning to her sterile life, of never again feeling this sense of connection, was unbearable. "The spring where we met," he said. 5 days from now, at sunset." He touched the brim of his hat, turned and melted back into the landscape, leaving her alone with a heart that beat with a wild, terrifying and exhilarating new rhythm. Louisa's return caused a small stir. She told a modified truth that her horse had thrown her. She'd twisted her ankle and had to shelter for the night before limping home. Her father's relief quickly curdled into stern lecture about her carelessness. Sheriff Thompson was more suspicious, his eyes narrowing, as he inspected the expertly crafted splint on her ankle. "Find a good Samaritan out there, did you, Louisa?" he asked, his tone laced with insinuation. A prospector was kind enough to help. She lied the words, tasting like ash. It was the first of many lies she would learn to tell, The next 5 days were an agony of waiting. The parsonage felt smaller, the town more judgmental. The sheriff's presence was a constant looming threat. But Louisa was different. A spark had been lit within her. She moved with a new purpose, her mind constantly replaying her time with Dakota. His voice, the quiet intensity of his gaze. On the 5th day, she feigned a headache and a need for fresh air. She slipped out as dusk began to fall, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She found him waiting by the spring, just as he'd promised. And so it began. Their secret meetings became her lifeblood. Twice a week she would find a reason to slip away to the canyons and mesas that were his home. He taught her things she never could have learned in books. He showed her how to read the tracks of animals in the dust, how to find water, how to identify the plants that could heal and those that could harm. She in turn read to him from her hidden novels, her voice soft in the vast wilderness, as she shared tales of faraway lands and impossible romances. He never pressed her for more than she was willing to give. True to his word, he started slow. The first time he touched her with clear intent, it was simply to brush a stray strand of hair from her face. The gesture was so tender, so respectful. It made her ache. The next time he took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and she felt a current pass between them that was more powerful than any sermon. The first kiss happened a month after they met by the light of a full moon that bathed the red rocks in an ethereal silver. He had just finished telling her an Apache creation story, a beautiful tale of the world being sung into existence. "Your stories are so beautiful," she whispered, her eyes shining. "They are the truth of our people," he said softly. He looked at her, his expression serious. "Louisa, you are becoming a part of my story now. Do you understand what that means?" "Yes," she said, her voice shaking but certain. He leaned in, slowly giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, then firm. It was nothing like the brutish fantasy she imagined a kiss would be. It was a question, a discovery, a quiet conversation without words. It was the taste of wild sage and the promise of a world she never knew she was missing. When they parted, she was breathless, reborn. But their hidden world could not remain hidden forever. Redemption had too many eyes. Mrs. Gable, the owner of the mercantile and the town's chief purveyor of gossip, saw Louisa heading out of town one evening, her direction unusual, her expression too radiant for a simple walk. A few days later, one of Sheriff Thompson's deputies, a young man named Wade Cooper, reported seeing smoke from a small, expertly hidden fire in the canyons, a place no white man ever camped. Thompson began to watch Louisa, his suspicion growing like a cancer. He followed her one evening, keeping his distance. From a high ridge through a spyglass, he saw them. He saw Louisa, his pure porcelain doll, sitting beside the Apache Dakota. He saw her laugh, a free, unburdened sound he had never heard from her. Then he saw Dakota lean in and kiss her. A murderous rage, cold and absolute, settled over Sheriff Brody Thompson. She was his, the town's symbol of purity, and she had sullied herself with a savage. He wouldn't just punish her. He would destroy the man who had taken what he believed was his property. He would burn Dakota's world to the ground and drag Louisa back to hers, whether she came willingly or not. Sheriff Thompson was not a man of complex emotions. He was a creature of raw, possessive instinct. Seeing Louisa with Dakota didn't break his heart. It offended his pride. It was a violation of the natural order as he saw it. A white woman, a preacher's daughter no less, belonged with a white man of authority. Him. The Apache was vermin, and Louisa was a fool who needed to be saved from her own sinful nature. But he was also a cunning predator. A direct confrontation would be messy. He couldn't just arrest Takoda for consorting with a white woman, not officially. He needed a crime. A real crime, one that would turn the entire town against the Apache and justify any action he chose to take. His opportunity came in the form of Frank Miller. Miller was a rancher with a small spread bordering the lands the Apache considered their territory. He was a loud, abrasive man who'd had several run-ins with Takoda's people over water rights and grazing land. Miller was also a man who owed Sheriff Thompson a significant amount of money from a series of high-stakes poker games. Thompson had been pressuring him to sell a parcel of his land, a parcel with a year-round spring to settle the debt. Miller had refused. A plan dark and intricate began to form in Thompson's mind. He could solve two problems with one stone. He rode out to the Miller ranch late one night under the cloak of a new moon. He didn't go as the sheriff. He went as a collector of debts. The argument was loud, echoing across the empty plains. Miller, drunk and belligerent, stood his ground. Thompson, his patience gone, his mind already set on his course, ended the argument with a single brutal swing of a tire iron he'd taken from the back of Miller's own wagon. He struck Miller down by the corral, the sound sickeningly final in the night air. Then the sheriff went to work. He was meticulous. He took a knife from his belt, a distinctive skinning knife, with a carved antler handle he had confiscated from an Apache brave months ago, and plunged it into Miller's chest, leaving it there. He dragged the body a short distance, making it look like a struggle. He rummaged through the small ranch house, taking a few silver dollars and a cheap watch to simulate a robbery. The final damning touch was the arrow. He had a small collection of Apache artifacts in his office, trophies from past skirmishes. He took a carefully crafted arrow, one with Takoda's clan markings on the fletching, and fired it into the wooden wall of the house as if it were a warning or a sign of conquest. He then mounted his horse and rode hard, circling back to town from the opposite direction, making sure to stop at the saloon for a loud, conspicuous drink before heading home. He had his crime. Now he just needed to spring the trap. 2 days passed. The secret meeting place by the spring had become Louisa and Takoda's sanctuary. Louisa arrived that evening, her heart light. She was slowly untangling the knots of fear and duty that had bound her for so long. With Takoda, she felt like her true self, a person she was only just beginning to know. He was waiting for her, but something was wrong. The usual calm in his eyes was replaced by a troubled watchfulness. "What is it?" she asked, her own sense of peace evaporating. "There is bad news on the wind," he said. One of Frank Miller's ranch hands found him this morning. He was murdered. A cold dread washed over Louisa. She knew of the disputes between Miller and the Apache. "They will blame your people," she whispered. "They will blame me," Takoda corrected her gently. "Miller and I exchanged words last week. He tried to run his cattle across our sacred ground. There were witnesses." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "Louisa, you must not come here again. It is no longer safe." "No," she protested, grabbing his arm. "I won't leave you. We can go away. We can run." A sad smile touched his lips. "And run where this is my home. My people are here. To run is to admit guilt. I have done nothing wrong." His sense of honor was as unyielding as the mountains. But Louisa knew the kind of justice redemption offered. It wasn't about truth. It was about blame. Their argument was cut short by the sound of hoofbeats. Not one rider, but many. A posse. Sheriff Thompson's voice boomed through the canyon, amplified by the rock walls. "Takoda, we know you're in there. Come on out nice and easy. You've got nowhere to run." Panic seized Louisa. "They can't find me here. My father. The town. Takoda acted instantly. He pushed her towards a narrow crevice in the rock face, hidden by overgrown brush. Hide. Do not make a sound. Do not come out, no matter what you hear. Promise me, Louisa. His eyes burned into hers. Tears streaming down her face, she nodded. I promise. He gave her one last, lingering look, a look that conveyed a universe of unspoken feelings. Then he turned and stepped out into the clearing, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Louisa watched through a tiny gap in the brush, her body trembling. Sheriff Thompson rode into the clearing, a smug, triumphant look on his face. He was flanked by 6 deputized townsmen, their faces a mixture of fear and righteous anger. Takoda Thompson said, spitting the name like a curse, "You're under arrest for the murder and robbery of Frank Miller. I did not kill that man." Takoda said, his voice calm and steady, betraying no fear. "Oh no. Then maybe you can explain this," Thompson said, holding up the antler-handled knife in a gloved hand. "Found this sticking out of his chest. Looks like your handiwork. And the arrow in his wall had your mark on it." Takoda's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew the knife. He knew the arrow. It was a frame-up, blatant and brutal. He said nothing, knowing his words were useless. "And we have a witness." Thompson continued, his eyes scanning the surrounding rocks as if he knew Louisa was there. "Said they saw you arguing with Miller just a few days ago. Threatened him, they said. It was a lie, all of it, a web of deceit woven to trap him." "Put the irons on him," Thompson ordered. 2 men dismounted and shackled Takoda's hands behind his back. As they pushed him forward, Thompson dismounted and stood directly in front of him. "You know your biggest crime wasn't killing that drunk," Thompson sneered, his voice low enough that only Takoda could hear. "It was touching what belongs to me. I saw you. I saw you with her. After you hang, I'm going to make her my wife. I'm going to scrub the memory of you out of her, understand?" From her hiding place. Louisa couldn't hear the words, but she saw the look on Takoda's face. For the first time, she saw a flash of pure, untamed fury in his eyes. He lunged, a sudden explosive movement, head-butting Thompson hard in the face. The sheriff staggered back, blood pouring from his nose. The deputies reacted instantly, swarming Takoda, beating him with the butts of their rifles. Louisa stifled a scream, her hand clamped over her mouth. They beat him to his knees, then dragged him bleeding and semi-conscious and threw him over a horse like a sack of grain. As they rode away, Sheriff Thompson paused, wiping the blood from his face with the back of his hand. He stared directly at the crevice where Louisa was hiding. A slow, cruel smile spread across his broken face. He knew. He knew she had seen it all. It was part of her punishment. Louisa remained frozen in the crevice long after the sound of the posse faded the silence of the canyon pressing in on her. The image of Takoda, beaten and bound, was burned into her mind. Thompson's final knowing smirk was a clear message. "This is your fault. This is what happens when you defy me." Shaking and numb with shock, she finally stumbled out of her hiding place. The small clearing, their sanctuary, now felt violated, haunted. The embers of their fire were a dull grey eye in the twilight. She knew she had to get back to town, but her body refused to obey. Every instinct screamed for her to run in the opposite direction, to flee into the wilderness and disappear. But where would she go? And what about Takoda? He was innocent, and she was the only one who knew it. The walk back to redemption was a nightmare journey through a landscape of fear. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper of accusation. When she finally slipped into the back door of the parsonage, her father was waiting for her in the darkened kitchen, his face a thunderous mask. "Where have you been, Louisa?" He demanded, his voice dangerously low. I went for a walk. I lost track of time," she stammered. "A walk," he boomed, taking a step forward. "The whole town is in an uproar. Sheriff Thompson has just brought in the Apache savage who murdered Frank Miller, and my daughter is out gallivanting in the wilderness where such creatures roam." "Have you lost your senses?" Louisa couldn't meet his eyes. The weight of her deceit was a physical burden. "The sheriff tells me he's been worried about you," her father continued, his voice relentless. "Says you've been distant, wandering off. He's concerned for your moral and physical safety." He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "This behavior ends now. You are not to leave this house without my permission. Your association with this town is a privilege you have abused. Until you remember your place as a dutiful daughter, this house will be your prison." He didn't know the truth, but his words were a chilling echo of her new reality. He locked her in her room, a place that had once been her refuge, now transformed into a cell. The next day, the town of Redemption was a hive of righteous fury. Men gathered in the saloon, their talk filled with words like justice and rope. Women whispered behind their hands at the mercantile, their eyes filled with a fearful, morbid excitement. Takoda was the focal point of all their hatred and fear, a convenient scapegoat for every hardship they'd ever endured in this unforgiving land. He was being held in the small stone jailhouse attached to the sheriff's office. Louisa could see it from her bedroom window. She watched as Thompson, his nose swollen and bruised, strutted in front of the building, accepting the congratulations of the townsfolk for his swift action. He was a hero. Desperation gnawed at Louisa. She was trapped, her testimony useless. If she spoke up, who would believe her? The preacher's daughter, claiming to be with an Apache in secret, while he was supposedly murdering a white rancher. They would call her a liar, a madwoman, or worse, a degenerate. Thompson would see to it. He would destroy her reputation, her family, and Takoda would still hang. Her silence was a cage, but speaking out seemed like a death sentence for them both. For 2 days, she paced her room like a trapped animal. She refused to eat the food her father left outside her door. She prayed not to her father's wrathful God, but to a vast, silent universe that had shown her a glimpse of true connection. She had to do something. The quiet, obedient girl was gone, burned away by rage and a fierce, protective love. Her chance came on the 3rd night. There was a town meeting at the church to discuss the arrangements for Takoda's trial, a formality before the inevitable hanging. From her window, she saw her father and nearly every other citizen file into the church, their lanterns bobbing in the dark. The town would be mostly empty. The jail would be guarded, but by whom Thompson wouldn't leave it to chance. But he wouldn't expect a threat from inside the parsonage. Using the metal handle of a hairbrush, she worked at the primitive lock on her bedroom door. It took what felt like an eternity, her hands sweating her ears, straining for any sound. Finally, with a small metallic click, the lock gave way. She crept down the stairs and out the back door, melting into the shadows she had once feared. She knew she couldn't free Takoda herself, but she had to see him. She had to let him know he wasn't alone. She circled around the back of the sheriff's office. A single deputy sat on a chair tilted back against the front wall, silhouetted by the light from the office window. It was the young one, Wade Cooper. Louisa had seen him around town. He was quiet, unlike the other boisterous, swaggering deputies. He always had a look of slight discomfort, as if his uniform didn't quite fit his soul. There was a small barred window on the side of the building, the window to Takoda's cell. It was high, but a stack of discarded crates sat nearby. Heart pounding, she climbed onto the crates, her movements as silent as the ones Takoda had taught her. She peered through the bars. He was sitting on the edge of a cot in the darkness, his back to the wall. He was bruised and battered, but he sat with an unbreakable dignity. He wasn't defeated. "Takoda," she whispered, her voice cracking. His head snapped up. He moved to the window in a single fluid motion. His eyes found hers in the gloom. "Louisa." He breathed, his voice rough. "You should not be here. It is too dangerous." "I don't care," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "He framed you. Thompson. He killed Miller. I know he did. How he knew I was there. When he took you, he looked right at me. This is all about me, about us. It's my fault." "No," Takoda said, his voice firm, reaching a hand through the bars. She pressed her fingers against his. His touch was cold from the iron, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her. "This is not your fault. This is about his hate. He would have found another reason. You have only shown me a world I thought was lost to me. Do not blame yourself for that. I'm going to fix this," she said, a new resolve hardening her voice. "I am going to prove your innocence." "Be careful, Louisa," he warned. "He is a snake. He will bite if you corner him." "I'm not the same girl who fell off her horse," she replied, meeting his gaze through the bars. "You taught me to see. Now I'm going to make them see too." She heard the meeting at the church, letting out the sounds of voices drifting on the night air. She had to go. She squeezed his fingers one last time and slipped away back into the shadows, a desperate plan beginning to form in her mind. She needed help. She couldn't do it alone, and her instincts told her to start with the one man who didn't seem to be enjoying the town's bloodlust, Deputy Wade Cooper. Louisa knew approaching Deputy Cooper directly was a risk. He was Thompson's man, sworn to uphold his law, but she'd seen the doubt in his eyes the way he looked away when the other men made crude jokes about the hanging. He was young, barely older than she was, and seemed out of place in the brutal calculus of redemption's justice. She waited until the next afternoon, a time when she knew Sheriff Thompson would be holding court at the saloon. She watched from her window as Wade Cooper emerged from the office, stretching his back. He didn't go to the saloon. Instead, he walked toward the livery stable. This was her chance. She slipped out of the parsonage and intercepted him near the stables, stepping out from behind a water trough. He started, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip. "Miss Parsons," he said, surprised. "You shouldn't be—" "Your father has you confined, doesn't he? I need to talk to you." "Deputy," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Somewhere private." He looked around nervously. "This isn't a good idea. It's about the murder," she said, her blue eyes locking onto his. "It's about an innocent man who is going to hang." Something in her intensity, her complete lack of fear, seemed to convince him. He hesitated, then gave a curt nod. The old blacksmith's shed. End of the street. 5 minutes. The shed was derelict and smelled of rust and cold ashes. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, piercing the dilapidated roof. Wade was already there. His arms crossed his face, a mask of anxiety. "All right, Miss Parsons, what's this about?" he asked. "If the sheriff finds out I met with you—" "The sheriff is the reason I'm here," Louisa said, taking a deep breath. "He's lying. Takoda didn't kill Frank Miller. Sheriff Thompson did." Wade's eyes widened in disbelief. He laughed, a short, humorless sound. That's a crazy accusation. Why would he do that, to get rid of a man he owed money to, and to frame a man he hates?" She said, her voice steady. Then came the hardest part. "He hates Takoda because of me. I have been meeting with him. In secret." She saw the shock on Wade's face, but she pushed on. "The night of the arrest I was there. I was hidden. I saw everything. The knife Thompson claimed to find. The arrow, it's all a lie." Wade shook his head, pacing the small space. "Miss Parsons, your word against the sheriff's. It's nothing, especially if you admit to consorting with the prisoner." "I know," she said, frustration creeping into her voice. "That's why we need proof. Real proof." She stopped and looked at him. "You don't believe Thompson, do you? I've seen you. You don't cheer when the other men talk about the hanging. You were there when he brought Dakota in. Did it feel right to you?" Wade stopped pacing and looked at the dirt floor. Thompson's nose was broken. He said the Apache did it, resisting arrest. "He did," Louisa confirmed. "After Thompson threatened him. After he threatened me through him." She saw a flicker of consideration in Wade's eyes and pressed her advantage. "Dakota taught me to observe, to see what's really there, not just what you're told to see. Think, Wade. Did you examine the crime scene yourself?" "No," he admitted. "The sheriff handled it personally. Said it was too dangerous. He brought the evidence back himself." "Exactly," Louisa said. "The knife, the arrow. He said he found them there. But what if he brought them with him? He has a collection of Apache things in his office, doesn't he?" Trophy's Wade's eyes narrowed in thought. "Yeah, he does. He won it all in a card game from some army scout." And Frank Miller Louisa continued her mind racing. "Everyone knows he was a drunk, but he wasn't a fool. Why would he let an Apache he was arguing with get close enough to stab him with a knife? It makes no sense. But a man he knew. A man he was having an argument with over money." Wade was silent for a long moment, the pieces clicking into place in his mind. He was a deputy because he believed in the law, but he was beginning to realize he was serving a man, not a principal. "What about the witness?" Wade asked. "The one who heard Dakota threaten Miller?" "There is no witness," Louisa said with certainty. "It's another lie, a detail to make the story sound convincing. Ask Thompson for his name. I guarantee he'll have an excuse for why you can't talk to him." Wade looked at her, his expression shifting from disbelief to a grim resolve. "If you're right, if even half of this is true, then a murderer is wearing a badge, and an innocent man is hours away from a noose," Louisa finished for him. "Will you help me?" He let out a long, slow breath. "What do we need to do?" Their plan was simple and incredibly dangerous. They needed to get into Thompson's office and find something that connected him to the murder, something he'd overlooked. Wade would be the key. That night he was scheduled for the late watch at the jail. Hours later, under the cover of darkness, Wade sat at the sheriff's desk, a lamp turned down low. Louisa slipped in through the back door he'd left unlocked. The office was Thompson's sanctum, filled with the smell of stale cigar smoke, leather, and whiskey. Wanted posters papered the walls. "He keeps his personal effects in that footlocker," Wade whispered, pointing to a sturdy wooden chest in the corner. It was locked. While Wade kept watch, Louisa, using a hairpin, this time worked at the lock. Her hands were surprisingly steady. The girl who used to tremble at her father's raised voice was now picking a lock in a sheriff's office to save the man she loved. The lock clicked open. Inside, beneath a jumble of papers and spare ammunition, they found a small leather ledger. Wade opened it. It was Thompson's personal account book, filled with columns of figures. And there on the most recent page was an entry, F. Miller. Debt, $200. Paid in full. Next to it was a date, the day of the murder. But the most damning part was a second notation, scribbled beside it, land transfer pending. He wasn't just collecting a debt, Wade breathed. He was taking Miller's land, the parcel with the spring. But this wasn't enough. It was motive, but not definitive proof. Louisa dug deeper into the chest. At the very bottom, wrapped in an oilcloth, was a heavy, rusted piece of metal, a tire iron. On one end, there were dark, reddish-brown stains, and caught in a crevice of the metal were a few strands of greying hair. Frank Miller's hair. He never got rid of the murder weapon, Louisa whispered in horror. Suddenly they heard footsteps on the boardwalk outside. Heavy, confident footsteps. It's Thompson Wade, hissed his face, pale. He's coming back. There was no time to hide. The doorknob turned, and Sheriff Thompson filled the doorway, a lit cigarillo clamped between his teeth. He stopped short, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Louisa looking defiant, and his own deputy looking guilty. Well, he drawled, his voice thick with menace. What's the meaning of this, deputy? I thought I told the Reverend to keep his daughter on a tighter leash. She came to plead for the Apache's life, Sheriff Wade said, his voice impressively steady. I was about to escort her home. Thompson laughed, a low, ugly sound. He moved toward Louisa, his gaze possessive. Wasting your breath, girl. That savage is going to swing at dawn, and you're going to be my wife before the month is out. You'll learn your place. His name is Dakota Louisa, said her voice, clear and cold. And he is a better man than you will ever be. The sheriff's face contorted with rage. He backhanded her across the face, the sharp crack of the blow echoing in the small room. Louisa stumbled back, but her eyes never left his, blazing with a fury that surprised them both. That was the final line. Wade drew his pistol, the click of the hammer, loud and definitive. That's enough, Brody. Thompson froze, staring at his deputy in disbelief. Have you lost your mind, boy? It's over. Wade said, his voice hard. We know you killed Frank Miller. He pulled the ledger from his shirt. We have your account book. The debt you marked, paid in full on the night he died. As Thompson stared at the ledger, Louisa made her move. She pulled the heavy tire iron from the folds of her skirt and held it up in the lamplight. The dark, crusted stains were undeniable. And we have this, she said, her voice shaking but strong. I believe this was your tool for collecting that debt. The color drained from Thompson's face. His swagger evaporated, replaced by the feral look of a cornered animal. In a flash, he drew his own gun, but he didn't aim at Wade. He aimed it squarely at Louisa. Drop it, deputy, or the girl dies, he snarled. Before Wade could respond, a new voice boomed from the doorway. Drop it yourself, Thompson. Reverend Michael Parsons stood there, his face a pale mask of shock, a double-barreled shotgun held steady in his hands. He had found Louisa's room empty and had followed his paternal fear, leading him to a truth far uglier than any sin he had ever preached against. He had heard it all. Thompson was trapped. His eyes darted between the two guns. With a guttural roar, he made his choice and fired at Louisa. But in that same instant, the splintering crack of wood erupted from the adjoining cell. Dakota, fueled by adrenaline, had slammed his body against the weak, rusted hinges of his cell door, bursting it from its frame. He launched himself into the office, tackling Thompson from the side, just as the sheriff fired. The shot went wide, shattering a window. The room descended into chaos as Dakota and the sheriff crashed to the floor. Wade lunged to help, disarming Thompson with a brutal blow to the wrist. The fight was short and decisive. Within seconds, Thompson lay on the floor, defeated, and disarmed, his reign of terror over. The sun rose that morning, not on a hanging, but on a reckoning. With the ledger and the murder weapon as undeniable proof, Brody Thompson was locked in his own cell. The town of Redemption was forced to look at the darkness it had harbored. A week later, Louisa and Dakota stood at the edge of town with 2 horses ready for a long journey. The life Louisa had known was over. She was an outcast. Reverend Parsons approached them, his face aged by the week's events. He looked at his daughter, his stern certainty shattered, replaced by a sorrowful understanding. "The world will not be kind to you," he said, his voice hoarse. "Kindness is not something I have ever known here," Louisa replied softly, but without bitterness. "I am going to find a life, Father. Not just endure one." She embraced him one last time, a final farewell. Then she turned to Takoda. He helped her onto her horse, his hand lingering on hers. Their future was an unwritten map, a territory they would have to navigate together. Two outcasts from two different worlds, they had found their own nation in each other. Without a backward glance at the town that had tried to break them, they turned their horses and rode toward the vast, open promise of the horizon. The story of Louisa and Takoda is a testament to a love that refused to be defined by borders, by prejudice, or by fear. It's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous savages are the ones who hide behind a badge or a pulpit, and that true redemption isn't found in a town, but in the courage to follow your own heart. Their journey was just beginning a difficult path between two worlds, but one they would walk together. What did you think of Louisa's transformation from a silent, obedient girl to a woman who would risk everything for justice and love, who was the true savage in the town of redemption? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of defiance and passion from the untamed heart of the American West, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales of history drama and the enduring human spirit. Thank you for listening,